Chapter 4. The Slow Mutants. 1. The gunslinger spoke slowly to Jake in the rising and falling inflections of one who speaks in his sleep. There were 3 of us that night. Cuthbert, Alan, and me. We weren't supposed to be there because none of us had passed from the time of children. We were still in our clouts, as the saying went. If we'd been caught, court would have striped us bloody. But we weren't. I don't think any of the ones that went before us were caught either. Boys must put on their father's pants in private, strut them in front of the mirror, and then sneak them back on their hangers. It was like that. The father pretends he doesn't notice the new way the pants are hung up, or the traces of boot-polish mustaches still under their noses. Do you see? The boy said nothing. He'd said nothing since they had passed from the daylight. The gunslinger, on the other hand, had talked hectically, feverishly, to fill the silence. He had not looked back at the light as they passed into the land beneath the mountains, but the boy had. The gunslinger had read the failing of day in the soft mirror of Jake's cheek. Now faint rose, now milk glass, now pallid silver, now the last dusk-glow touch of evening. Now nothing. The gunslinger had struck a false light, and they had gone on. Finally they camped. No echo from the man in black returned to them. Perhaps he had stopped to rest, too. Or perhaps he floated onward, and without running lights, through nighted chambers. The sowing night cotillion, the Kamala some of the older folk called it after the word for rice, was held once a year in the Western Hall. The gunslinger went on. The proper name was the Hall of Grandfathers, but to us it was only the Western Hall. The sound of dripping water came to their ears. A courting rite, as any spring dance surely is. The gunslinger laughed deprecatingly. The insensate walls turned the sound into a loon-like wheeze. In the old days the books say it was the welcoming of spring, what was sometimes called New Earth, or fresh Kamala, but civilization, you know. He trailed off, unable to describe the change inherent in that featureless noun, the death of romance and the lingering of its sterile, carnal revenant, a world living on the forced respiration of glitter and ceremony. The geometric steps of make-believe courtship during the sowing night cotillion that had replaced the truer, madder scribble-scrabble of love which he could only intuit dimly. Hollow grandeur in place of true passions which might once have built kingdoms and sustained them. He found the truth with Susan Delgado and Megis, only to lose it again. Once there was a king, he might have told the boy. The eld whose blood, attenuated though it may be, still flows in my veins. But kings are done, lad. In the world of light, anyway. They made something decadent out of it, the gunslinger said at last. A play. A game. In his voice was all the unconscious distaste of the ascetic and the eremite. His face, had there been stronger light to illumine it, would have shown harshness and sorrow, the purest kind of condemnation. His essential force had not been cut or diluted by the passage of years. The lack of imagination that still remained in that face was remarkable. But the ball, the gunslinger said, the sowing night cotillion. The boy did not speak, did not ask. There were crystal chandeliers, heavy glass with electric sparklights. It was all light. It was an island of light. We sneaked into one of the old balconies, the ones that were supposed to be unsafe and roped off. But we were boys. And boys will be boys, so they will. To us everything was dangerous, but what of that? Had we not been made to live forever? We thought so, even when we spoke to each other of our glorious deaths. We were above everyone and could look down on everything. I don't remember that any of us said anything. We only drank it up with our eyes. There was a great stone table where the gunslingers and their women sat at meat, watching the dancers. A few of the gunslingers also danced, but only a few. And they were the young ones. The one who sprang the trap on hacks was one of the dancers, I seem to recall. The elders only sat, and it seemed to me they were half embarrassed in all that light, all that civilized light. They were revered ones, the feared ones, the guardians. But they seemed like hostlers in that crowd of cavaliers with their soft women. There were 4 circular tables loaded with food, and they turned all the time. The cook's boys never stopped coming and going from 7 until 3 o'clock the next morning. The tables were like clocks, and we could smell roast pork, beef, lobster, chickens, baked apples. The odors changed as the tables turned. There were ices and candies. There were great flaming skewers of meat. Martin sat next to my mother and father. I knew them even from so high above, and once she and Martin danced, slowly and revolvingly, and the others cleared the floor for them and clapped when it was over. The gunslingers did not clap, but my father stood slowly and held his hands out to her, and she went to him, smiling, holding out her own. It was a moment of enormous gravity. Even we felt it in our high hiding place. My father had by then taken control of his quartet, you must ken, the tet of the gun, and was on the verge of becoming Dean of Gilead, if not all in-world. The rest knew it. Martin knew it better than any, except perhaps for Gabrielle Veris, that was. The boy spoke at last, and with seeming reluctance. "She was your mother?" "Aye. Gabrielle of the Waters, daughter of Alan, wife of Stephen, mother of Roland." The gunslinger spread his hands apart in a mocking little gesture that seemed to say, "Here I am, and what of it?" Then he dropped them into his lap again. My father was the last Lord of Light. The gunslinger looked down at his hands. The boy said nothing more. "I remember how they danced," the gunslinger said. "My mother and Martin, the gunslinger's counselor. I remember how they danced, revolving slowly together and apart in the old steps of courtship." He looked at the boy, smiling. But it meant nothing, you know, because power had been passed in some way that none of them knew but all understood, and my mother was grown root and branch to the holder and wielder of that power. Was it not so? She went to him when the dance was over, didn't she? And clasped his hands. Did they applaud? Did the hall ring with it as those pretty boys and their soft ladies applauded and lauded him? Did it? Did it? Bitter water dripped distantly in the darkness. The boy said nothing. "I remember how they danced," the gunslinger said softly. "I remember how they danced." He looked up at the unseeable stone roof, and it seemed for a moment that he might scream at it, rail at it, challenge it blindly. Those blind and tongueless tonnages of granite that now bore their tiny lives like microbes in its stone intestine. What hand could have held the knife that did my father to his death? "I'm tired," the boy said, and then again said no more. The gunslinger lapsed into silence, and the boy laid over and put one hand between his cheek and the stone. The little flame in front of them guttered. The gunslinger rolled a smoke. It seemed he could see the crystal light still in the eye of his memory, hear the shout of accolade, empty in a husked land that stood even then hopeless against a grey ocean of time. Remembering that island of light hurt him bitterly, and he wished he had never held witness to it, or to his father's cuckoldry. He passed smoke between his mouth and nostrils, looking down at the boy. How we make large circles in earth for ourselves, he thought. Around we go, back to the start, and the start is there again, resumption, which was ever the curse of daylight. How long before we see daylight again? He slept. After the sound of his breathing had become long and steady and regular, the boy opened his eyes and looked at the gunslinger with an expression of sickness and love. The last light of the fire caught in one pupil for a moment and was drowned there. He went to sleep. Two. The gunslinger had lost most of his time sense in the desert, which was changeless. He lost the rest of it here in the passage under the mountains, which was lightless. Neither of them had any means of telling the clock, and the concept of hours became meaningless, abnegated. In a sense, they stood outside of time. A day might have been a week, or a week a day. They walked, they slept, they ate thin meals that did not satisfy their bellies. Their only companion was a steady, thundering rush of the water, drilling its auger path through the stone. They followed it, and drank from its flat, mineral-salted depth, hoping there was nothing in it that would make them sick or kill them. At times the gunslinger thought he saw fugitive drifting lights like corpse lamps beneath its surface, but supposed they were only projections of his brain, which had not forgotten the light. Still, he cautioned the boy not to put his feet in the water. The range-finder in his head took them on steadily. The path beside the river, for it was a path, smooth, sunken to a slight concavity, led always upward toward the river's head. At regular intervals they came to curved stone pylons with sunken ring-boats. Perhaps once oxen or stage horses had been tethered there. At each was a steel flagon holding an electric torch, but these were all barren of life and light. During the third period of rest before sleep, the boy wandered away a little. The gunslinger could hear small conversations of rattled pebbles as Jake moved cautiously. "Careful," he said. "You can't see where you are." "I'm crawling. It's... Say!" "What is it?" The gunslinger half-crouched, touching the haft of one gun. There was a slight pause. The gunslinger strained his eyes uselessly. "I think it's a railroad," the boy said dubiously. The gunslinger got up and walked toward the sound of Jake's voice, leading with one foot lightly to test for pitfalls. "Here." A hand reached out and cat's-pawed the gunslinger's face. The boy was very good in the dark, better than Roland himself. His eyes seemed to dilate until there was no color left in them. The gunslinger saw this as he struck a meager light. There was no fuel in this rock womb, and what they had brought with them was going rapidly to ash. At times the urge to strike a light was well-nigh insatiable. They had discovered one could grow as hungry for light as for food. The boy was standing beside a curved rock wall that was lined with parallel metal staves running off into the darkness. Each carried black nodes that might once have been conductors of electricity. And beside and below, set only inches off the stone floor, were tracks of bright metal. What might have run on those tracks at one time? The gunslinger could only imagine sleek electric bullets firing their courses through this forever night with affrighted searchlight eyes going before. He had never heard of such things, but there were many remnants of the gone world, just as there were demons. The gunslinger had once come upon a hermit who'd gained a quasi-religious power over a miserable flock of kine, keepers by possession of an ancient gasoline pump. The hermit crouched beside it, one arm wrapped possessively around it, and preached wild, guttering sermons. He occasionally placed the still bright steel nozzle, which was attached to a rotted rubber hose, between his legs. On the pump, In perfectly legible, although rust-clotted letters, was a legend of unknown meaning. Amico. Lead-free. Amico had become the totem of a thunder god, and they had worshipped him with the slaughter of sheep and the sound of engines. Rum, 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 rum. Hulks, the gunslinger thought. Only meaningless hulks poking from sands that once were seas, and now a railroad. "We'll follow it," he said. The boy said nothing. The gunslinger extinguished the light, and they slept. When Roland awoke, the boy was up before him, sitting on one of the rails and watching him sightlessly in the dark. They followed the rails like blind men, Roland leading, Jake following. They slipped their feet along one rail always, also like blind men. The steady rush of the river off to the right was their companion. They did not speak, and this went on for 3 periods of waking. The gunslinger felt no urge to think coherently or to plan. His sleep was dreamless. During the 4th period of waking and walking, they literally stumbled on a handcar. The gunslinger ran into it chest high, and the boy, walking on the other side, struck his forehead and went down with a cry. The gunslinger made a light immediately. "Are you all right?" The words sounded sharp, angry, and he winced at them. "Yes." The boy was holding his head gingerly. He shook it once to make sure he had told the truth. They turned to look at what they had run into. It was a flat, square plate of metal that sat mutely on the tracks. There was a seesaw handle in the center of the square. It descended into a connection of cogs. The gunslinger had no immediate sense of the thing's purpose, but the boy grasped it at once. "It's a handcar." "What?" "Handcar," the boy said impatiently, "like in the old cartoons. Look." He pulled himself up and went to the handle. He managed to push it down, but it took all his weight hung over the handle to turn the trick. The handcar moved a foot, with silent timelessness on the rails. "Good," said a faint, mechanical voice. It made them both jump. "Good. Push a—" The mechanical voice died out. "It works a little hard," the boy said, as if apologizing for the thing. The gunslinger pulled himself up beside Jake and shoved the handle down. The handcar moved forward obediently, then stopped. "Good. Push again," the mechanical voice encouraged. He had felt a drive shaft turn beneath his feet. The operation pleased him, and so did the mechanical voice, although he intended to listen to that no longer than necessary. Other than the pump at the way station, this was the first machine he'd seen in years that still worked well. But the thing disquieted him, too. It would take them to their destination that much the quicker. He had no doubt whatever that the man in black had meant for them to find this, too. "Neat, huh?" the boy said, and his voice was full of loathing. The silence was deep. Roland could hear his organs at work inside his body, and the drip of water, and nothing else. "You stand on one side, I stand on the other," Jake said. "You'll have to push by yourself until it gets rolling good, then I can help. First you push, then I push. We'll go right along, get it?" "I get it," the gunslinger said. His hands were in helpless, despairing fists. "But you'll have to push by yourself until it gets rolling good," the boy repeated, looking at him. The gunslinger had a sudden, vivid picture of the great hall a year or so after the sewing night cotillion. By then it had been nothing but shattered shards in the wake of revolt, civil strife, and invasion. This image was followed by one of Allie, the scarred woman from Tull, pushed and pulled by bullets that were killing her for no reason at all, unless reflex was a reason. Next came Cuthbert Allgood's face, laughing as he went downhill to his death, still blowing that God's damned horn. And then he saw Susan's face, twisted, made ugly with weeping. "All my old friends," the gunslinger thought, and smiled hideously. "I'll push," the gunslinger said. He began to push, and when the voice began to speak, "Good, push again, good, push again," He sent his hand fumbling along the post upon which the seesaw handle had been balanced. At last he found what he was surely looking for, a button. He pushed it. "Goodbye, pal," the mechanical voice said cheerily, and was then blessedly silent for some hours. 3. They rolled on through the dark, faster now, no longer having to feel their way. The mechanical voice spoke up once, suggesting they eat crisp Allah, and again to say that nothing satisfied at the end of a hard day like larchies. Following this second piece of advice, it spoke no more. Once the awkwardness of a buried age had been run off the handcar, it went smoothly. The boy tried to do his share, and the gunslinger allowed him small shifts, but mostly he pumped by himself in large and chest-stretching risings and fallings. The underground river was their companion, sometimes closer on their right, sometimes further away. Once it took on huge and thunderous hollowness, as if passing through some great cathedral narthex. Once the sound of it disappeared almost altogether. The speed and the made wind against their faces seemed to take the place of sight and to drop them once again into a frame of time. The gunslinger estimated they were making anywhere from 10 to 15 miles an hour, always on a shallow, almost imperceptible uphill grade that wore him out deceptively. When they stopped, he slept like the stone itself. Their food was almost gone again. Neither of them worried about it. For the gunslinger, the tenseness of a coming climax was as imperceivable but as real and accretive as the fatigue of propelling the handcar. They were close to the end of the beginning. Or at least, he was. He felt like a performer placed on center stage minutes before the rise of the curtain. Settled in position, with his first line held securely in his mind, he heard the unseen audience rattling programs and settling in their seats. He lived with a tight, tidy ball of unholy anticipation in his belly and welcomed the exercise that let him sleep. And when he did sleep, it was like the dead. The boy spoke less and less. But at their stopping place, one sleep period not long before they were attacked by the slow mutants, he asked the gunslinger almost shyly about his coming of age. "For I would hear more of that," he said. The gunslinger had been leaning with his back against the handle, a cigarette from his dwindling supply of tobacco clamped in his lips. He'd been on the verge of his usual unthinking sleep when the boy asked his question. "Why would thee sill to know that?" he asked, amused. The boy's voice was curiously stubborn, as if hiding embarrassment. "I just would." And after a pause he added, "I always wondered about growing up. I bet it's mostly lies." "What you'd hear of wasn't my growing up," the gunslinger said. "I suppose I did the first of that not long after what thee'd hear of." "When you fought your teacher," Jake said remotely. "That's what I want to hear." Roland nodded. Yes, of course. The day he had tried the line. That was a story any boy might want to hear, all right. My real growing up didn't start until after my da sent me away. I finished doing it at one place and another along the way. He paused. I saw a not man hung once. "A not man? I don't understand." "You could feel him but couldn't see him." Jake nodded, seeming to understand. "He was invisible." Roland raised his eyebrows. He had never heard the word before. "Do you say so?" "Yes." "Then let it be so. In any case, there were folk who didn't want me to do it. Felt they'd be cursed if I did it, but the fellow had gotten a taste for rape. Do you know what that is?" "Yes," Jake said. "And I bet an invisible guy would be good at it, too. How did you catch him?" "That's a tale for another day." Knowing there would be no other days. Both of them knowing there would be no others. 2 years after that, I left a girl in a place called Kingstown, although I didn't want to.
Sure you did,
the boy said, and the contempt in his voice was no less for the softness of his tone.
Got to catch up with that tower, am I right? Got to keep a-riding, just like the cowboys on my dad's network.
Roland felt his face flush with heat in the dark, but when he spoke his voice was even. That was the last part, I guess. Of my growing up, I mean. I never knew any of the parts when they happened. Only later did I know that. He realized with some unease that he was avoiding what the boy wanted to hear. I suppose the coming of age was part of it, at that, he said, almost grudgingly. It was formal, almost stylized. Like a dance. He laughed unpleasantly. The boy said nothing. It was necessary to prove one's self in battle. The gunslinger began. 4. Summer and hot. Full Earth had come to the land like a vampire lover that year, killing the land and the crops of the tenant farmers, turning the fields of the castle city of Gilead white and sterile. In the west, some miles distant and near the borders that were the end of the civilized world, fighting had already begun. All reports were bad, and all of them paled to insignificance before the heat that rested over this place of the center. Cattle lolled empty-eyed in the pens of the stockyards. Pigs grunted lustlessly, unmindful of sows and sex and knives whetted for the coming fall. People whined about taxes and conscription, as they always did. But there was an apathy beneath the empty passion play of politics. The center had frayed like a rag rug that had been washed and walked on and shaken and hung and dried. The thread that held the last jewel at the breast of the world was unraveling. Things were not holding together. The earth drew in its breath in the summer of the coming eclipse. The boy idled along the upper corridor of this stone place which was home, sensing these things, not understanding. He was also dangerous and empty, waiting to be filled. It was 3 years since the hanging of the cook who had always been able to find snacks for hungry boys. Roland had lengthened and filled out both at shoulder and hip. Now, dressed only in faded denim pants, 14 years old, he had come to look like the man he would become, lean and lank and quick on his feet. He was still unbedded, but 2 of the younger slatterns of a West Town merchant had cast eyes on him. He had felt a response, and felt it more strongly now. Even in the coolness of the passage he felt sweat on his body. Ahead were his mother's apartments, and he approached them incuriously, meaning only to pass them and go upward to the roof, where a thin breeze and the pleasure of his hand awaited. He had passed the door when a voice called him, "You, boy!" It was Martin, the counselor. He was dressed with a suspicious, upsetting casualness, black whipcord trousers almost as tight as leotards, and a white shirt open halfway down his hairless chest. His hair was tousled. The boy looked at him silently. "Come in. Come in, don't stand in the hall. Your mother wants to speak to you." He was smiling with his mouth, but the lines of his face held a deeper, more sardonic humor. Beneath that, and in his eyes, there was only coldness. In truth, his mother did not seem to want to see him. She sat in the low-backed chair by the large window in the central parlor of her apartments, the one which overlooked the hot blank stone of the central courtyard. She was dressed in a loose, informal gown that kept slipping from one white shoulder, and looked at the boy only once, a quick, glinting, rueful smile, like autumn sun on a rill of water. During the interview which followed, she studied her hands rather than her son. He saw her seldom now, and the phantom of cradle songs, "Chusset, chisset, chasset," had almost faded from his brain. But she was a beloved stranger. He felt an amorphous fear, and an inchoate hatred for Martin, his father's closest adviser, was born. "Are you well, Ro?" she asked him softly. Martin stood beside her, a heavy, disturbing hand near the juncture of her white shoulder and white neck, smiling on them both. His brown eyes were dark to the point of blackness with smiling. "Yes," he said. "Your studies go well? Lenny is pleased? And Court?" Her mouth quirked at this second name as if she had tasted something bitter. "I'm trying," he said. They both knew he was not flashingly intelligent like Cuthbert, or even quick like Jamie. He was a plodder and a bludgeoner. Even Alan was better at studies. "And David?" She knew his affection for the hawk. The boy looked up at Martin, still smiling paternally down on all this. "Past his prime." His mother seemed to wince. For a moment Martin's face seemed to darken, his grip on her shoulder to tighten. Then she looked out into the hot whiteness of the day, and all was as it had been. "It's a charade," he thought, "a game. Who is playing with whom?" "You have a cut on your forehead," Martin said, still smiling, and pointed a negligent finger at the mark of Court's latest "thank you for this instructive day" bashing. "Are you going to be a fighter like your father, or are you just slow?" This time she did wince. "Both," the boy said. He looked steadily at Martin and smiled painfully. Even in here it was very hot. Martin stopped smiling abruptly. "You can go to the roof now, boy. I believe you have business there." "My mother has not yet dismissed me, bondsman." Martin's face twisted as if the boy had lashed him with a quirt. The boy heard his mother's dreadful, woeful gasp. She spoke his name, but the painful smile remained intact on the boy's face, and he stepped forward. "Will you give me a sign of fealty, bondsman, in the name of my father whom you serve?" Martin stared at him, rankly unbelieving. "Go," Martin said gently. "Go, and find your hand." Smiling rather horribly, the boy went. As he closed the door and went back the way he came, he heard his mother wail. It was a banshee sound, and then, unbelievably, the sound of his father's man striking her and telling her to shut her quack. To shut her quack. And then he heard Martin's laugh. The boy continued to smile as he went to his test. "5. Jamie had come from the shops, and when he saw the boy crossing the exercise yard, he ran to tell Roland the latest gossip of bloodshed and revolt to the west. But he fell aside, the words all unspoken. They had known each other since the time of infancy, and as boys they had dared each other, cuffed each other, and made 1,000 explorations of the walls within which they had both been birthed. The boy strode past him, staring without seeing, grinning his painful grin. He was walking toward Court's cottage, where the shades were drawn to ward off the savage afternoon heat. Court napped in the afternoon so that he could enjoy to the fullest extent his evening tomcat forays into the mazed and filthy brothels of the lower town. Jamie knew in a flash of intuition, knew what was to come, and in his fear and ecstasy he was torn between following Roland and going after the others. Then his hypnotism was broken, and he ran toward the main buildings, screaming, "Cuthbert! Alan! Thomas!" His screams sounded puny and thin in the heat. They had known, all of them in that intuitive way boys have, that Roland would be the first of them to try the line. But this was too soon. The hideous grin on Roland's face galvanized him as no news of wars, revolts, and witchcrafts could have done. This was more than words from a toothless mouth given over fly-specked heads of lettuce. Roland walked to the cottage of his teacher and kicked the door open. It slammed backward, hit the plain rough plaster of the wall, and rebounded. He had never been inside before. The entrance opened on an austere kitchen that was cool and brown, a table, 2 straight chairs, 2 cabinets, a faded linoleum floor tracked in black paths from the cooler set in the floor to the counter where knives hung and to the table. Here was a public man's privacy, the faded refuge of a violent midnight carouser who had loved the boys of 3 generations roughly and made some of them into gunslingers. "Court!" He kicked the table, sending it across the room and into the counter. Knives from the wall rack fell in twinkling jackstraws. There was a thick stirring in the other room, a half-sleep clearing of the throat. The boy did not enter, knowing it was sham, knowing that Court had awakened immediately in the cottage's other room and stood with one glittering eye beside the door, waiting to break the intruder's unwary neck. "Court, I want you, bondsman!" Now he spoke the high speech, and Court swung the door open. He was dressed in thin underwear shorts, a squat man with bow legs, runneled with scars from top to toe, thick with twists of muscle. There was a round, bulging belly. The boy knew from experience that it was spring steel. The one good eye glared at him from the bashed and dented hairless head. The boy saluted formally. "Teach me no more, bondsman. Today I teach you." "You are early, Puler," Court said casually, but he also spoke the high speech. 2 years early at the very best, I should judge. I will ask only once. Will you cry off?" The boy only smiled his hideous, painful smile. For Court, who had seen the smile on a score of bloodied, scarlet-skied fields of honor and dishonor, it was answer enough. Perhaps the only answer he would have believed. "It's too bad," the teacher said absently. "You have been a most promising pupil, the best in 24 years, I should say. It will be sad to see you broken and set upon a blind path, but the world has moved on. Bad times are on horseback." The boy still did not speak, and would have been incapable of any coherent explanation had it been required, but for the first time the awful smile softened a little. "Still there is the line of blood," Court said. "Revolt and witchcraft to the west or no, I am your bondsman, boy. I recognize your command and bow to it now, if never again, with all my heart." And Court, who had cuffed him, kicked him, bled him, cursed him, made mock of him, and called him the very eye of syphilis, bent to one knee and bowed his head. The boy touched the leathery, vulnerable flesh of his neck with wonder. "Rise, bondsman, in love." Court stood slowly, and there might have been pain behind the impassive mask of his reamed features. "This is waste. Cry off, you foolish boy. I break my own oath. Cry off and wait." The boy said nothing. "Very well. If you say so, let it be so." Court's voice became dry and businesslike. 1 hour, and the weapon of your choice." "You will bring your stick?" "I always have." "How many sticks have been taken from you, Court?" Which was tantamount to asking how many boys have entered the square yard beyond the great hall and returned as gunslinger apprentices. "No stick will be taken from me today," Court said slowly. "I regret it. There is only the once, boy. The penalty for over-eagerness is the same as the penalty for unworthiness. Can you not wait?" The boy recalled Martin standing over him, the smile, and the sound of a blow from behind the closed door. "No." "Very well. What weapon do you choose?" The boy said nothing. Court's smile showed a jagged ring of teeth. "Wise enough to begin. In an hour, you realize you will in all probability Never see your father, your mother, or your cobabbies again."
"I know what exile means," Roland said softly.
"Go now, and meditate on your father's face. Much good will it do you."
The boy went, without looking back. Six. The cellar of the barn was spuriously cool, dank, smelling of cobwebs and earth water. The sun lit it in dusty rays from narrow windows, but here was none of the day's heat. The boy kept the hawk here, and the bird seemed comfortable enough. David no longer hunted the sky. His feathers had lost the radiant animal brightness of 3 years ago, but the eyes were still as piercing and motionless as ever. "You cannot friend a hawk," they said, "unless you are half a hawk yourself, alone, and only a sojourner in the land, without friends or the need of them. The hawk pays no coinage to love or morals." David was an old hawk now. The boy hoped that he himself was a young one. "Hi," he said softly, and extended his arm to the tethered perch. The hawk stepped onto the boy's arm and stood motionless, unhooded. With his other hand the boy reached into his pocket and fished out a bit of dried jerky. The hawk snapped it deftly from between his fingers and made it disappear. The boy began to stroke David very carefully. Court most probably would not have believed it if he had seen it, but Court did not believe the boy's time had come either. "I think you die today," he said, continuing to stroke. "I think you will be made a sacrifice, like all those little birds we trained you on. Do you remember? No? It doesn't matter. After today, I am the hawk, and each year on this day I'll shoot the sky in your memory." David stood on his arm, silent and unblinking, indifferent to his life or death. "You are old," the boy said reflectively, "and perhaps not my friend. Even a year ago you would have had my eyes instead of that little string of meat, isn't it so? Court would laugh. But if we get close enough to that Cherry man, if he don't suspect, which will it be, David? Age or friendship?" David did not say. The boy hooded him and found the jesses which were looped at the end of David's perch. They left the barn. 7. The yard behind the great hall was not really a yard at all, but only a green corridor whose walls were formed by tangled, thick-grown hedges. It had been used for the rite of coming of age since time out of mind, long before Court and his predecessor Mark, who had died of a stab wound from an overzealous hand in this place. Many boys had left the corridor from the east end, where the teacher always entered, as men. The east end faced the great hall and all the civilization and intrigue of the lighted world. Many more had slunk away, beaten and bloody, from the west end, where the boys always entered, as boys, forever. The west end faced the farms and the hut-dwellers beyond the farms. Beyond that, the tangled barbarian forests. Beyond that, Garland, and beyond Garland, the Mohaine Desert. The boy who became a man progressed from darkness and unlearning to light and responsibility. The boy who was beaten could only retreat forever and forever. The hallway was as smooth and green as a gaming field. It was exactly 50 yards long. In the middle was a swatch of shaven earth. This was the line. Each end was usually clogged with tense spectators and relatives, for the ritual was usually forecast with great accuracy. 18 was the most common age. Those who had not made their test by the age of 25 usually slipped into obscurity as freeholders, unable to face the brutal all-or-nothing fact of the field and the test. But on this day there were none but Jamie de Curry, Cuthbert Allgood, Alan Johns, and Thomas Whitman. They clustered at the boy's end, gape-mouthed and frankly terrified. "Your weapon, stupid!" Cuthbert hissed in agony. "You forgot your weapon!" "I have it," the boy said. Dimly he wondered if the news of this lunacy had reached yet to the central buildings, to his mother, and to Martin. His father was on a hunt not due back for days. In this he felt a sense of shame, for he felt that in his father he would have found understanding, if not approval. "Has Court come?"
"Court is here."
The voice came from the far end of the corridor, and Court stepped into view, dressed in a short singlet. A heavy leather band encircled his forehead to keep sweat from his eyes. He wore a dirty girdle to hold his back straight. He held an ironwood stick in one hand, sharp on one end, heavily blunted and spatulate on the other. He began the litany which all of them, chosen by the blind blood of their fathers all the way back to the eld, had known since early childhood, learned against the day when they would perchance become men.
"Have you come here for a serious purpose, boy?"
"I have come for a serious purpose."
"Have you come as an outcast from your father's house?"
"I have so come." And would remain outcast until he had bested Court. If Court bested him, he would remain outcast forever.
"Have you come with your chosen weapon?"
"I have."
"What is your weapon?"
This was the teacher's advantage, his chance to adjust his plan of battle to the sling or spear or ba or bow. "My weapon is David." Court halted only briefly. He was surprised, and very likely confused. That was good. Might be good.
"So then have you at me, boy?"
"I do."
"In whose name?"
"In the name of my father."
"Say his name."
"Stephen Deschain, of the line of Eld."
"Be swift, then."
And Court advanced into the corridor, switching his stick from one hand to the other. The boys sighed flutteringly, like birds, as their Dandin stepped to meet him. "My weapon is David, teacher." Did Court understand? And if so, did he understand fully? If he did, very likely all was lost. It turned on surprise and on whatever stuff the hawk had left in him. Would he only sit, disinterested and stupid, on the boy's arm, while Court struck him brainless with the ironwood? Or seek escape in the high, hot sky? As they drew close together, each for the nonce still on his side of the line, the boy loosened the hawk's hood with nerveless fingers. It dropped to the green grass, and Court halted in his tracks. He saw the old warrior's eyes drop to the bird and widen with surprise and slow dawning comprehension. Now he understood.
"Oh, you little fool!"
Court nearly groaned, and Roland was suddenly furious that he should be spoken to so. "At him!" he cried, raising his arm, and David flew like a silent brown bullet, stubby wings pumping once, twice, 3 times, before crashing into Court's face, talons searching, beak digging. Red drops flew up into the hot air. "Hi, Roland!" Cuthbert screamed deliriously. First blood to my bosom!" He struck his chest hard enough to leave a bruise there that would not fade for a week. Court staggered backwards, off balance. The ironwood staff rose and beat futilely at the air about his head. The hawk was an undulating, blurred bundle of feathers. The boy, meanwhile, arrowed forward, his hand held out in a straight wedge, his elbow locked. This was his chance, and very likely the only one he'd have. Still, Court was almost too quick for him. The bird had covered 90% of his vision, but the ironwood came up again, spatulate end forward, and Court cold-bloodedly performed the only action that could turn events at that point. He beat his own face 3 times, biceps flexing mercilessly. David fell away, broken and twisted. One wing flapped frantically at the ground. His cold predator's eyes stared fiercely into the teacher's bloody, streaming face. Court's bad eye now bulged blindly from its socket. The boy delivered a kick to Court's temple, connecting solidly. It should have ended it, but it did not. For a moment Court's face went slack, and then he lunged, grabbing for the boy's foot. The boy skipped back and tripped over his own feet. He went down a sprawl. He heard from far away the sound of Jamie screaming in dismay. Court was ready to fall on him and finish it. Roland had lost his advantage, and both of them knew it. For a moment they looked at each other, the teacher standing over the pupil, with gouts of blood pouring from the left side of his face, the bad eye now closed except for a thin slit of white. There would be no brothels for Court this night. Something ripped jaggedly at the boy's hand. It was David, tearing blindly at whatever he could reach. Both wings were broken. It was incredible that he still lived. The boy grabbed him like a stone, unmindful of the jabbing, diving beak that was taking the flesh from his wrist in ribbons. As Court flew at him, all spread-eagled, the boy threw the hawk upward. "Hi! David! Kill!" Then Court blotted out the sun and came down atop of him. 8. The bird was smashed between them, and the boy felt a calloused thumb probe for the socket of his eye. He turned it, at the same time bringing up the slab of his thigh to block Court's crotch-seeking knee. His own hand flailed against the tree of Court's neck in 3 hard chops. It was like hitting ribbed stone. Then Court made a thick grunting. His body shuddered. Faintly, the boy saw one hand flailing for the dropped stick, and with a jackknifing lunge, he kicked it out of reach. David had hooked one talon into Court's right ear, the other battered mercilessly at the teacher's cheek, making it a ruin. Warm blood splattered the boy's face, smelling of sheared copper. Court's fist struck the bird once, breaking its back. Again, and the neck snapped away at a crooked angle, and still the talon clutched. There was no ear now, only a red hole tunneled into the side of Court's skull. The third blow sent the bird flying, at last clearing Court's face. The moment it was clear, the boy brought the edge of his hand across the bridge of his teacher's nose, using every bit of his strength and breaking the thin bone. Blood sprayed. Court's grasping, unseeing hand ripped at the boy's buttocks, trying to pull his trousers down, trying to hobble him. Roland rolled away, found Court's stick, and rose to his knees. Court came to his own knees, grinning. Incredibly, they faced each other that way from either side of the line, although they had switched positions, and Court was now on the side where Roland had begun the contest. The old warrior's face was curtained with gore. The one seeing eye rolled furiously in its socket. The nose was smashed over to a haunted, leaning angle. Both cheeks hung in flaps. The boy held the man's stick like a Grand Points player waiting for the pitch of the rawhide bird. Court double-feinted, then came directly at him. Roland was ready, not fooled in the slightest by this last trick, which both knew was a poor one. The ironwood swung in a flat arc, striking Court's skull with a dull, thudding noise. Court fell on his side, looking at the boy with a lazy, unseeing expression. A tiny trickle of spit came from his mouth. "Yield, or die," the boy said. His mouth was filled with wet cotton. And Court smiled. Nearly all consciousness was gone, and he would remain tended in his cottage for a week afterward, wrapped in the blackness of a coma. But now he held on with all the strength of his pitiless, shadowless life. He saw the need to palaver in the boy's eyes, and even with a curtain of blood between the two of them, understood that the need was desperate. "I yield, Gunslinger. I yield, smiling. You have this day remembered the face of your father, and all those who came before him. What a wonder you have done." Court's clear eye closed. The gunslinger shook him gently, but with persistence. The others were around him now, their hands trembling to thump his back and hoist him to their shoulders. But they held back, afraid, sensing a new gulf. Yet this was not as strange as it could have been, because there had always been a gulf between this one and the rest. Court's eye rolled open again. "The key," the gunslinger said. "My birthright, teacher. I need it." His birthright was the guns. Not the heavy ones of his father, weighted with sandalwood, but guns all the same. Forbidden to all but a few. In the heavy vault under the barracks, where he by ancient law was now required to abide, away from his mother's breast, hung his apprentice weapons, heavy, cumbersome barrel-shooters of steel and nickel. Yet they had seen his father through his apprenticeship, and his father now ruled, at least in name. "Is your need so fearsome, then?" Court muttered, as if in his sleep.
"So pressing? I feared so. So much need should have made you stupid. And yet you won.
The key?
The hawk was a fine ploy, a fine weapon. How long did it take you to train the bastard?"
"I never trained David. I friended him. The key?"
"Under my belt. Gunslinger."
The eye closed again. The gunslinger reached under Court's belt, feeling the heavy press of the man's belly, the huge muscles there now slack and asleep. The key was on a brass ring. He clutched it in his hand, restraining the mad urge to thrust it up to the sky in a salutation of victory. He got to his feet and was finally turning to the others when Court's hand fumbled for his foot. For a moment the gunslinger feared some last attack and tensed, but Court only looked up at him and beckoned with one crusted finger.
"I'm going to sleep now,"
Court whispered calmly.
"I'm going to walk the path. Perhaps all the way to the clearing at the end of it. I don't know. I teach you no more, gunslinger. You have surpassed me, and 2 years younger than your father, who was the youngest. But let me counsel."
"What?" impatiently.
"Wipe that look off your face, maggot."
In his surprise, Roland did as he was bid, although, being crouched hidden behind his face as we all are, could not know it. Court nodded, then whispered a single word.
"Wait."
"What?" The effort it took the man to speak lent his words great emphasis.
"Let the word and the legend go before you. There are those who will carry both."
His eyes flicked over the gunslinger's shoulder.
"Fools, perchance. Let your shadow grow hair on its face. Let it become dark."
He smiled grotesquely.
"Given time, words may even enchant an enchanter. Do you take my meaning, gunslinger?"
"Yes, I think I do."
"Will you take my last counsel as your teacher?"
The gunslinger rocked back on his heels, a hunkered, thinking posture that foreshadowed the man. He looked at the sky. It was deepening, purpling. The heat of the day was failing, and thunderheads in the west foretold rain. Lightning tines jabbed the placid flank of the rising foothills miles distant. Beyond that, the mountains. Beyond that, the rising fountains of blood and unreason. He was tired. Tired into his bones and beyond. He looked back at Court. "I will bury my hawk tonight, teacher, and later go into Lower Town to inform those in the brothels that will wonder about you. Perhaps I will comfort one or two a little." Court's lips parted in a pained smile, and then he slept. The gunslinger got to his feet and turned to the others. "Make a litter and take him to his house. Then bring a nurse. No, 2 nurses, okay?" They still watched him, caught in a baited moment that none of them could immediately break. They still looked for a corona of fire or a magical change of features. 2 nurses, the gunslinger repeated, and then smiled. They smiled in return, nervously. "You goddamned horse-drover!" Cuthbert suddenly yelled, grinning. "You haven't left enough meat for the rest of us to pick off the bone." "The world won't move on tomorrow," the gunslinger said, quoting the old adage with a smile. "Alan, you butterbutt, move your freight." Alan set about the business of making the litter. Thomas and Jamie went together to the main hall and the infirmary. The gunslinger and Cuthbert looked at each other. They had always been the closest, or as close as they could be under the particular shades of their characters. There was a speculative, open light in Bert's eyes, and the gunslinger controlled only with great difficulty the need to tell him not to call for the test for a year or even 18 months, lest he go west. But they had been through a great ordeal together, and the gunslinger did not feel he could risk saying such a thing without a look on his face that might be taken for arrogance. "I've begun to scheme," he thought, and was a little dismayed. Then he thought of Martin, of his mother, and he smiled a deceiver's smile at his friend. "I am to be the first," he thought, knowing it for the first time, although he had thought of it idly many times before. "I am the first." "Let's go," he said. "With pleasure, Gunslinger." They left by the east end of the hedge-bordered corridor. Thomas and Jamie were returning with the nurses already. They looked like ghosts in their white and gauzy summer robes, crossed at the breast with red. "Shall I help you with the hawk?" Cuthbert asked. "Yes," the gunslinger said. "That would be lovely, Bert." And later, when darkness had come, and the rushing thunder showers with it, while huge phantom caissons rolled across the sky and lightning washed the crooked streets of the lower town in blue fire, while horses stood at hitching rails with their heads down and their tails drooping, the gunslinger took a woman and lay with her. It was quick and good. When it was over, and they lay side by side without speaking, it began to hail with a brief, rattling ferocity. Downstairs and far away, someone was playing Hey Jude ragtime. The gunslinger's mind turned reflectively inward. It was in that hail-splattered silence, just before sleep overtook him, that he first thought that he might also be the last. (9) The gunslinger didn't tell the boy all of this, but perhaps most of it came through anyway. He had already realized that this was an extremely perceptive boy, not so different from Alan, who was strong in that half-empathy, half-telepathy they called the touch. "You asleep?" the gunslinger asked. "No." "Did you understand what I told you?" "Understand it?" the boy asked with surprising scorn. "Understand it? Are you kidding?" "No." But the gunslinger felt defensive. He had never told anyone about his coming of age before, because he felt ambivalent about it. Of course, the hawk had been a perfectly acceptable weapon, yet it had been a trick, too, and a betrayal, the first of many. "And tell me, am I really preparing to throw this boy at the man in black?" "I understood it all right," the boy said. "It was a game, wasn't it?" "Do grown men always have to play games? Does everything have to be an excuse for another kind of game? Do any men grow up, or do they only come of age?" "You don't know everything," the gunslinger said, trying to hold his slow anger. "You're just a boy." "Sure, but I know what I am to you." "And what is that?" the gunslinger asked, tightly. "A poker chip." The gunslinger felt an urge to find a rock and brain the boy. Instead, he spoke calmly. "Go to sleep. Boys need their sleep." And in his mind he heard Martin's echo, "Go and find your hand." He sat stiffly in the darkness, stunned with horror and terrified for the first time in his existence of the self-loathing that might come afterward. 10. During the next period of waking, the railway angled closer to the underground river, and they came upon the slow mutants. Jake saw the first one and screamed aloud. The gunslinger's head, which had been fixed straight forward as he pumped the handcar, jerked to the right. There was a rotten jack-o'-lantern greenness below them, pulsating faintly. For the first time he became aware of odor, faint, unpleasant, wet. The greenness was a face, what might be called a face by one of charitable bent. Above the flattened nose was an insectal node of eyes, peering at them expressionlessly. The gunslinger felt an atavistic crawl in his intestines and privates. He stepped up the rhythm of arms and handcar handles slightly. The glowing face faded. "What the hell was that?" the boy asked, crawling to him. "What?" The words stopped dumb in his throat as they came upon and then past a group of 3 faintly glowing forms standing between the rails and the invisible river, watching them, motionless. "They're slow mutants," the gunslinger said. "I don't think they'll bother us. They're probably just as frightened of us as we are of—" One of the forms broke free and shambled toward them. The face was that of a starving idiot. The faint, naked body had been transformed into a knotted mess of tentacular limbs and suckers. The boy screamed again and crowded against the gunslinger's leg like a frightened dog. One of the thing's tentacle arms pawed across the flat platform of the handcar. It reeked of the wet and the dark. The gunslinger let loose of the handle and drew. He put a bullet through the forehead of the starving idiot face. It fell away, its faint swamp fire glow fading, an eclipsed moon. The gun flash lay bright and branded on their dark retinas, fading only reluctantly. The smell of expended powder was hot and savage and alien in this buried place. There were others, more of them. None moved against them overtly, but they were closing in on the tracks, a silent, hideous party of rubberneckers. "You may have to pump for me," the gunslinger said. "Can you?" "Yes." "Then be ready." The boy stood close to him, his body poised. His eyes took in the slow mutants only as they passed, not traversing, not seeing more than they had to. The boy assumed a psychic bulge of terror, as if his very id had somehow sprung out through his pores to form a shield. If he had the touch, the gunslinger reasoned, that was not impossible. The gunslinger pumped steadily, but did not increase his speed. The slow mutants could smell their terror. He knew that, but he doubted if terror alone would be enough to motivate them. He and the boy were, after all, creatures of the light, and whole. How they must hate us, he thought, and wondered if they had hated the man in black in the same way. He thought not, or perhaps he had passed among them only like the shadow of a dark wing in this greater darkness. The boy made a noise in his throat, and the gunslinger turned his head almost casually. 4 of them were charging the handcar in a stumbling way, one of them in the process of finding a hand grip. The gunslinger let go of the handle and drew again, with the same sleepy, casual motion. He shot the lead mutant in the head. The mutant made a sighing, sobbing noise and began to grin. Its hands were limp and fish-like, dead. The fingers clove to one another like the fingers of a glove long immersed in drying mud. One of these corpse hands found the boy's foot and began to pull. The boy shrieked aloud in the granite womb. The gunslinger shot the mutant in the chest. It began to slobber through the grin. Jake was going off the side. The gunslinger caught one of his arms and was almost pulled off balance himself. The thing was amazingly strong. The gunslinger put another bullet in the mutant's head. One eye went out like a candle. Still it pulled. They engaged in a silent tug-of-war for Jake's jerking, wriggling body. The slow mutants yanked on him like a wishbone. The wish would undoubtedly be to dine. The handcar was slowing down. The others began to close in, the lame, the halt, the blind. Perhaps they only looked for a Jesus to heal them, to raise them Lazarus-like from the darkness. It's the end for the boy, the gunslinger thought with perfect coldness. This is the end he meant. Let go and pump or hold on and be buried. The end for the boy. He gave a tremendous yank on the boy's arm and shot the mutant in the belly. For one frozen moment, its grip grew even tighter, and Jake began to slide off the edge again. Then the dead mud mitts loosened, and the slow mutie fell on its face behind the slowing handcar, still grinning. "I thought you'd leave me," the boy was sobbing. I thought... "Hold on to my belt," the gunslinger said. "Hold on just as tight as you can." The hand worked into his belt and clutched there. The boy was breathing in great, convulsive, silent gasps. The gunslinger began to pump steadily again, and the handcar picked up speed. The slow mutants fell back a step and watched them go, with faces hardly human, or pathetically so, faces that generated the weak phosphorescence common to those weird deep-sea fishes that live under incredible black pressure, faces that held no anger or hate, but only what seemed to be a semi-conscious, idiot regret. "They're thinning," the gunslinger said. The drawn-up muscles of his lower belly and privates relaxed the smallest bit. There, the slow mutants had put rocks across the track. The way was blocked. It had been a quick, poor job, perhaps the work of only a minute to clear, but they were stopped, and someone would have to get down and move them. The boy moaned and shuddered closer to the gunslinger. The gunslinger let go of the handle, and the handcar coasted noiselessly to the rocks, where it thumped to rest. The slow mutants began to close in again, almost casually, almost as if they had been passing by, lost in a dream of darkness, and had found someone of whom to ask directions. A street-corner congregation of the damned beneath the ancient rock. "Are they going to get us?" the boy asked calmly. "Never in life. Be quiet a second." He looked at the rocks. The mutants were weak, of course, and had not been able to drag any of the boulders to block their way, only small rocks, only enough to stop them, to make someone— "Get down," the gunslinger said. "You'll have to move them. I'll cover you." "No," the boy whispered. "Please." "I can't give you a gun, and I can't move the rocks and shoot, too. You have to get down." Jake's eyes rolled terribly. For a moment his body shuddered in tune with the turnings of his mind, and then he wriggled over the side and began to throw rocks to the right and the left, working with mad speed, not looking up. The gunslinger drew and waited. Two of them, lurching rather than walking, went for the boy with arms like dough. The guns did their work, stitching the darkness with red-white lances of light that pushed needles of pain into the gunslinger's eyes. The boy screamed and continued to throw away rocks to either side. Witch-glow leaped and danced. Hard to see now, that was the worst. Everything had gone to shadows and after-images. One of them, glowing hardly at all, suddenly reached for the boy with rubber boogeyman arms. Eyes that ate up half the mutie's head rolled wetly. Jake screamed again and turned to struggle. The gunslinger fired without allowing himself to think before his spotty vision could betray his hands into a terrible quiver. The two heads were only inches apart. It was the mutie who fell. Jake threw rocks wildly. The mutants milled just outside the invisible line of trespass, closing a little at a time, now very close. Others had caught up, swelling their number. "All right," the gunslinger said. "Get on, quick!" When the boy moved, the mutants came at them. Jake was over the side and scrambling to his feet. The gunslinger was already pumping again, all out. Both guns were holstered now. They must run. It was their only chance. Strange hands slapped the metal plane of the car's surface. The boy was holding his belt with both hands now, his face pressed tightly into the small of the gunslinger's back. A group of them ran onto the tracks, their faces full of that mindless, casual anticipation. The gunslinger was full of adrenaline. The car was flying along the tracks into the darkness. They struck the 4 or 5 pitiful hulks full force. They flew like rotten bananas struck from the stem. On and on into the soundless, flying, banshee darkness. After an age, the boy raised his face into the Made wind, dreading and yet needing to know. The ghost of gun flashes still lingered on his retinas. There was nothing to see but the darkness, and nothing to hear but the rumble of the river. "They're gone," the boy said, suddenly fearing an end to the tracks in the darkness, and the wounding crash as they jumped the rails and plunged to twisted ruin. He had ridden in cars. Once his humorless father had driven at 90 on the New Jersey Turnpike, and had been stopped by a cop who ignored the 20 Elmer Chambers offered with his license and gave him a ticket anyway. But he had never ridden like this, with the wind and the blindness and the terrors behind and ahead, with the sound of the river like a chuckling voice, the voice of the man in black. The gunslinger's arms were pistons in a lunatic human factory. "They're gone," the boy said timidly, the words ripped from his mouth by the wind. "You can slow down now. We left them behind." But the gunslinger did not hear. They careened onward into the strange dark.